Welcome to Wednesday Inspirational Book Lounge. I'm Anna Murby, your host. This season, we're reading Mephibosheth, A Twisted Life of Unexpected Grace and Mercy, the true story of a medically fragile child whose life became a living testimony of God's grace. This book invites us into a story of deep love and brokenness, revealing how God's mercy often shines brightest in the most fragile lives. Enjoy the episode.
Mephibosheth, A Twisted Life of Unexpected Grace and Mercy by Chaplain Aaron. Read by Hubert Carl. Chapter 4. Preparing Room for the Unknown. 1982 was not a quiet year for Paul and Dale. It was one of those hinge years that arrive without warning and leaves with nothing untouched. Their youngest son was preparing to leave for Bible college in the fall. And with that departure, the long chapter of raising their own children was drawing to a close. For the first time in decades, they stood in the threshold of becoming an empty nester. They had options, but none of them felt small. At the time, Paul and Dale were managing an apartment complex in Citrus Heights, a practical and steady means of replacing income from the restaurant business that they had already surrendered. Years earlier, they had sold their ranch and given everything to the Lord. Yes, given all. That decision had not left them diminished. It had sharpened their clarity. What remained now was not the question of whether God would lead them forward, but how. Pastor Paul was already carrying the responsibility of an emerging deaf church, grown from a Bible study that had begun in Carmichael Bible Church. The ministry was no longer theoretical. It required space, planning, hospitality, and stamina. Home Bible studies met regularly. Counseling conversations happened at the kitchen table. The work was active, relational, and demanding. And yet, even with all this, the sense lingered that something more was being prepared, something that had not yet taken shape. That is the story of the deaf church. At the same time, and after much prayer and many long conversations, Dale began looking for a house. Not just any house. They needed something larger than an apartment, something flexible, something that could hold people, not just furniture. They asked around. They listened. They waited. Then came one quiet conversation with a real estate agent about a foreclosed property listed at the almost unbelievable price of $78,000. When they went to see it, the condition matched the price. The house had been expanded again and again over the years. A 7-bedroom, 2-story structure stitched together by additions that reflected need more than design. It had suffered deeply under neglect. When Paul and Dale arrived with the agent, they had to physically push the garage door open against a heap of garbage piled between the garage and kitchen doors. The smell lingered. The walls told stories of despair. It was several colors at once, none of them agreeing. The place felt wounded, and yet it had bones. It was exactly the kind of house most people would walk away from, and exactly the kind Paul and Dale paused to consider. The blessing came through a long-time friend of their restaurant years, Mr. Gardner. When he heard about their decision, he did not hesitate. He loaned them the money for the down payment, $15,000, making it possible to purchase the home directly from the bank. With escrow closing, the path forward became unmistakable. What follows was not a renovation montage. It was a labor of love. It was just Paul and Dale, joined by a few faithful friends, hauling out debris, cleaning room by room, repairing what could be repaired, and making the home possible. Not beautiful, not finished, just safe, just usable. The kind of work that leaves your hands sore and your spirit strangely steady. Once the house crossed that threshold, from impossible to livable, it was time to move. Friends from church surprised them in a way that still brings warmth at the memory. They did not simply loan moving trucks, they sent their movers. What could have been weeks of strain became a shared celebration. Over several long days, everything was transferred from the apartment complex to the new house. The process felt endless. Boxes appeared from nowhere. Furniture multiplied. Each room filled slowly and perfectly. And then, suddenly, they were home. With their own children grown and gone, Paul and Dale now stood inside their new home that was full of boxes and furniture. That was when the next step arrived: the home study. In order to care for children within the foster system, especially those with special needs, approval was not optional. It came through Alta Regional, California Regional Center, Sacramento County Social Services, the County Fire Department, etc. And it required that the house itself become safety certified. Every door, from front to back, had to function correctly. Cabinets required latches. Drawers had to be secured. Medication needed separate locked storage. Smoke alarms had to be placed and tested. Fire extinguishers had to be visible and accessible. Safety was not assumed, it had to be proved. One requirement quickly rose to the surface: the kitchen. A friend from church stepped in to help, and in Paul's spare moments, alongside others, the kitchen slowly came together. Cabinets were repaired, appliances were replaced, counter space cleared. Over time, it became more than functional. It became central. It would feed many people. It would host conversations. It would hold grief and laughter in equal measure. Then came paperwork. There was paperwork, and more paperwork, and paperwork for paperwork. Forms were filled out, corrected, resubmitted, filled out again. It felt like an entire forest had been reduced to paper for the sake of one opportunity. At that point, it was only foster care, but the system required precision. Dates mattered. Signatures mattered. Language mattered. To their surprise, social services was grateful. Older couples were rare. Couples willing to care for the unknown were rarer still. The early placements were often temporary, respite care for children with developmental delays who needed short-term support. This quickly became a pattern. Children arrived with various disabilities, medical needs, and emergency circumstances. Every size, every temperament, every story unfinished. Paul and Dale learned quickly. They became wise about what was manageable. Boundaries were not refusals. They were protections. They learned which placements fit the environment of the house that was increasingly structured for non-ambulatory children. Children who required quiet, stability, and constant attention regardless of age or size. Occasionally there were surprises. One emergency placement involved a 14-year-old girl, nonverbal, autistic, and intensely physical. She could overturn furniture with ease. No medication had been provided. One afternoon, Dale took her to the department store to buy proper undergarments. What followed was chaos. A frightened cashier, a dressing room erupting with sound, clothing thrown over stall walls, and what appeared to be a wrestling match between a petite foster mother and a tall autistic teenager. Nonverbal did not mean quiet. Eventually, both emerged exhausted, triumphant only in survival, and went home with bags of clothes. After more than a week, it became clear that this placement was not appropriate. These moments were part of the education. There were many similar emergency requests that followed in those early years. The phone rang often, sometimes late, sometimes with urgency that left no room for deliberation. Each call carried a story. Some spoken clearly, others hinted at between the pauses. Every request came with the same weight. Someone needs to help right now. At first, saying yes had come easy. It always had. Giving and caring were not skills Paul and Dale had learned. They were habits formed over a lifetime. Saying no felt unnatural, even disobedient. However, experience is a quiet teacher, and over time they began to recognize that wisdom was not found in saying yes to everything, but in saying yes to what they had truly been prepared to carry. Their recent experience had sharpened their discernment. They were not withholding from compassion. They were refining it. Each emergency placement had taught them something about safety, sustainability, and stewardship. Love alone was not enough. It had to be paired with capacity. Some needs, as real as they were, required environments different from what their home could faithfully provide. They also knew their limits. Gradually, a clarity began to form. After prayer, conversation, and honest self-examination, Paul and Dale came to understand their long-term calling was not in every possible placement, but in one very specific category: non-ambulatory and medically fragile infants. This was not a decision made lightly. Non-ambulatory meant that a child would grow in size but not in physical independence. As the years passed, the body remained profoundly disabled, often quadriplegic, frequently bedridden, requiring constant care for a lifetime. These were children who would never run off and play with other kids. They also would never feed themselves, turn over unassisted, or speak words of recognition. Their lives would be measured not by milestones achieved, but stability preserved. At the time, medical services had begun moving away from medical institutions for these children, recognizing compassion. Children thrive better in homes rather than in facilities. This was especially true of those who were medically fragile. A home could offer consistency, touch, voice, and relationship, things no institution, no matter how well funded, could replicate. Paul and Dale understood this environment. Their house had already begun to take the shape of quiet rhythms and controlled movement. It was suitable for stillness, for monitoring, for gentle routines that would not change abruptly. They knew how to manage equipment, schedules, medications, and long nights that required vigilance rather than activity. Social workers came and went, often unannounced. Their visits carried a peculiar attention, like spotting a police car in your rearview mirror, even when you know you're doing nothing wrong. Everything was always in order, but the nervous energy never faded. By 1983, the house was ready. By 1984, it was active. Paul and Dale assumed that this would be the pattern of their life: temporary placements, constant transitions, faithful service. Then the phone rang. The call was unexpected, yet somehow anticipated. A child had been born to a mother whose body had been overwhelmed by drugs. The child was severely deformed, twisted in ways that defied comprehension. Few people anywhere would be willing to consider such a placement. But Paul and Dale had prayed for something very specific. They had asked the Lord for one child, one particular young boy, whom they would recognize immediately. When the call came, they knew. It was the boy. It would be the child they would name Mephibosheth.
Thank you for joining us today. Make sure to come back next week for another installment of Mephibosheth, A Twisted Life of Unexpected Grace and Mercy.